Hi, my name is Gene. This is my first time here.
Hi, Gene.
I had a little bit of a problem understanding the relationship of sleeping or being asleep and non-meditation that you spoke of this morning. I was wondering if you could...
Okay, yes. So did you understand when I described the waking state as the awareness of being plus the awareness of sensations and perceptions and thoughts and images?
Yes.
And then sensations and perceptions leave us, and that leaves us in the dream state, that is, the awareness of being plus the awareness of thoughts and images.
Mm-hmm.
And then thoughts and images disappear, and that just leaves us with the awareness of being,
Mm-hmm.
which is construed by the mind as the deep sleep state,
Okay.
but which is not really a state that comes and goes. It's just our fundamental nature that underlies the waking and dreaming states. So I equated this deep sleep, or the awareness of being, with non-meditation. The reason I refer to it as non-meditation is because the awareness of being is not something we do. It's what we are.
Mm-hmm.
So if by meditation, because most forms of meditation require, as I suggested last night, either the directing of attention towards an object, a mantra, the flame, the breath, or the directing, that's the progressive path, or the directing of attention towards its source, that's the direct path. But in both these cases, we do something. The mind does something. It directs its attention either outwards towards the object or inwards towards the self. And then there's this third type of meditation, which doesn't require doing anything, either directing attention outwards or directing attention inwards. Why doesn't it require doing anything? Because being or being aware is what we are. We don't have to practice being. We are being. So in that sense, the awareness of being is not an activity, it's not a form of meditation. It is, so I use the word non-meditation to try to evoke this absolute effortlessness of simply being. In the same way that deep sleep is absolutely effortless. Nobody lies in their bed deeply asleep, making the effort to maintain being asleep. No, the reason we like deep sleep, the reason that deep sleep is so restful is precisely because it's the only experience we have that doesn't require any effort. It is absolutely effortlessness. That's why it's peaceful. What I have been referring thus far as non-meditation is this absolute effortlessness of simply being, which is like being deeply asleep. It's the same experience as being deeply asleep, except that we are wide awake.
I guess the next question is, how do you get to that?
How can you could only get to something that you are not already. There's no question of getting to what you already are. If I were to ask you, Gene, stand up and take a step towards yourself, how would you take a step towards it? You can't. You are already. You are already yourself. You can't go. Your own body is the only thing you can't take a step towards. If I asked you to take a step towards the fan or the table or the speaker or the window, then you can go there. Anything you take a step towards is not yourself. The slightest effort you make in meditation would be an effort towards something other than yourself. Any effort you make in meditation would take you away from yourself. That's why I think I suggested last night that all meditations, not just the progressive path meditations where we direct our attention towards an object, but even self-inquiry, ultimately has to be dropped. Because we cannot make an effort to be what we already are. It's a matter of recognition or understanding, not a matter of efforting or practicing or doing. It's about being, not doing.
So there is recognition that
There's a recognition, which means, as of course you know, recognito, to know again. It's not some marvelous new experience that we have as a result of the great effort. It's just a knowing again of what we've always known, in fact, but we don't. That is ourself, but that we don't know clearly. It's a clear seeing of ourself. It's not a new experience that we acquire. It's not some new knowledge. It's not an experience that happens to us. It's just a recognition of what we are. So this approach can sometimes be a confrontation for most, if not all of us who have come to this approach, having previously been either on a progressive path, mantra meditation, mindfulness, and so on, or even those of us that have been on the direct path. Usually people come to the direct path after 30 years on the progressive path. And then they spend 10 years on the direct path, and which is a subtler form of doing. So most, if not all of us, come with this feeling that meditation is something we do, and it's true, over the years our doing becomes more and more and more and more refined until we come to this pathless path, this non-meditation, which requires absolutely no effort at all. Remember, Ashtavakra, happiness belongs to that supremely lazy person for whom even blinking is too much trouble.
Hi, Rupert. The thing that you talked about, non-meditation, that's life transforming, and I could never perceive meditation in the form of non-meditation. However, and you also said that it doesn't take effort to be non-meditative. However, if I take a personal example from my own life, this issue of, for example, social media and scrolling unconsciously, it does seem to...
For example? Sorry, carry on. For example?
For example, when I'm, let's say social media is a big distraction for me. And when I'm scrolling on social media, I seem to be, not aware or not in a state of non-meditation. And it seems to take a lot of effort for me to become aware or be non-meditative. So, and you are saying that it doesn't take effort. So,
yes.
How can I effortlessly, become aware in that state?
Okay. If we are lost in the content of our experience, it is legitimate and necessary to make the effort to disentangle ourselves and return to our true nature of simply being or being aware. And when I speak of non-meditation requiring no effort, I'm speaking from the point of view of being or being aware. I'm not speaking from the point of view of the separate self. I'm not making that concession. The progressive path, the path that says, direct your attention towards a flame or a mantra, that starts with the presumption of separation. It presumes that we are a separate self. It presumes the existence of King Lear. And he says, okay, King Lear, you're miserable. Let's start like this. Instead of paying attention to 10,000 things, give your attention to one thing. Focus on the mantra. That's making a concession to King Lear. The teaching, of course, knows that King Lear is an illusion, but that's too high a teaching for King Lear at the moment. So it says, okay, King Lear, you think you're King Lear, pay attention to your mantra. At least King Lear stops paying attention to 10,000 things, and now he's just paying attention to one thing. So his mind begins to steady. And then, as the mantra disappears, as long as King Lear doesn't go off fantasizing about 10,000 things, if he doesn't replace the mantra with another object, then he has the opportunity to subside into his being and recognize himself as John Smith. So it's true that if King Lear believes I am King Lear, a separate person, then he has to make an effort, either to steady his attention on an object or to trace his way back to the subject. He has to make an effort. However, having arrived at the experience, I am John Smith, then no more effort is necessary. John Smith doesn't need an effort. He doesn't have to maintain himself as John Smith. He is John Smith. So an effort is only required for King Lear. So what is King Lear? The awareness entangled in experience. So yes, if we are entangled in experience and seem as a result to be a separate self and to suffer accordingly, then we have to make the effort to disentangle ourselves, go back to our true nature. Once we've got back to our true nature, then no effort is required. So in non-meditation, we start with our true nature. We don't arrive there as a process, after a process. So here, we've started with our true nature. We took 2 minutes last night to go back to being, and then we stayed there.
My first aha moment was when I realized that it's like that black and white silhouette picture where there's an old lady with a nose and a scarf, and you look at it from a different angle, and it's a pretty young woman with a bonnet on. Do you know that black and white photo? And I figured that's sort of what happens to me. I'm either sort of in my ego, or I can back away and be aware that I'm aware.
No, but your analogy is very nice, because it's not two images. You're not going from one image to another. You're always looking at the same image that appears different ways depending on how you look at it. It's the same thing. It's not sorrow or happiness. Sorrow and happiness are the same thing. Sorrow is just the veiling of happiness. So you're right, it's always the same experience. It's not two different experiences. So it's a very nice analogy, that, yes.
And so then what happens is I ask myself, and as I go about life, and are you aware you're aware? I have those moments when I can ask myself, when I'm not engaged in something and I'm driving the car from home to work or something, are you aware that you're aware? But I guess for me it's still all an effort. Not just to bring myself to, are you aware that you're aware? That's a thought. You know, we treat thoughts as objects, but this is a thought I have to think, which is, are you aware that you're aware? And then even to stay there is a bit of an effort for me. So this thing about being, effortlessly being, I don't have that experience.
All right. So what happens when you ask yourself the question, are you aware that you are aware? Or an easier question, just ask yourself the question, are you aware of being? What happens then? You're quite right, that's a thought. You ask yourself the question, am I aware of being? What happens next?
I think I stay aware of being for a very short amount of time if I can stay thinking about it.
No, but if you're thinking about it, you're aware of thinking, you're not aware of being.
Well, there's the problem, I think.
Well, so what's the answer to the question, are you aware of being?
Yes.
Well, if in between my question, are you aware of being, and your answer, yes, there was only the awareness of thinking, then you wouldn't have answered yes to the question.
Really?
Yeah. Because in between my question and your answer, you would not have been aware of being, you would have been aware of thinking. But you answered yes to the question. So there must have been a gap between my thought, are you aware of being, and your thought, yes. There must have been a gap in which you were aware of being, not thinking. Otherwise, you would not have answered yes to the question.
Okay.
So you must have been aware of being, albeit momentarily, in between those two thoughts.
I mean, sometimes it doesn't really hurt. Hurt's not the right word, but sometimes it feels like it's such an effort to come back from to awareness, and that, like you said, that's the thinking part, is when I'm trying to come back.
Are you aware now?
Yeah.
How much effort was required for you to answer yes, to have the experience from which you answered yes? It didn't seem as if you made a lot of effort. I just asked you the question. There was a momentary pause, and you said yes. Or did you make a lot of effort to be aware of being aware in that moment? No, it was just obvious.
Okay.
It required absolutely no effort at all. You heard the question, "Are you aware?" Brief pause. Yes. You made no effort at all in that pause. On the contrary, it was because all your efforts came to an end that being aware shone in your experience. You were no longer aware of efforting, you were aware of being.
I guess it just feels like an effort to be aware of being. It feels like an effort.
Being aware of being is the only experience there is, which is of course not an objective experience, that requires no effort. It's the only experience there is that is effortless. The awareness of being. The awareness of being is the experience that shines when all efforting comes to an end. It's what remains when all efforts cease.
I might be making this harder than it is.
Yeah. Yes, I think you're conceiving of being aware or being as some extraordinary, marvelous, mystical, spiritual experience that you have to make a great effort to achieve or acquire or recognize. And no, awareness of being is the simplest, I mean this literally, the simplest experience there is. It's the most fundamental experience there is. We have the experience of being continually. We are never for a moment not aware of being. Only nearly all the time, our awareness of being is mixed with the content of our experience. And that's why everybody, all 8 billion of us, have the experience of being or being myself. But not everybody knows their self clearly, because their sense of their self, their sense of their being, the awareness of being is mixed with their experience, with their thoughts and feelings. But everybody has the experience of being 24/7. All 8, not just those of us that are interested in these matters, all 8 billion of us, and all 8 trillion of us, if we include all the animals, have the experience of being constantly. But in the vast majority of cases, our awareness of being, that is our knowledge of ourself, is mixed with the content of experience, and therefore we don't know ourselves clearly. We know ourselves dimly, partially. And it is this partial self-knowledge that is responsible for the veiling of peace and happiness, which are our nature. Really, the feeling of being, it's the most intimate, obvious, simple experience, non-experience that there is. Francis, you're quite right that consciousness is not any kind of object. So in that sense, to say that consciousness is the container within which all experience appears would seem to suggest that consciousness was some kind of a thing, albeit a vast container. And you're right to take objection with that. It's a very imperfect formulation. The purpose of this formulation is not to define consciousness, it is to evoke the experience of consciousness in us. It's not supposed to be accurate, it's supposed to be efficient. So you're right in that sense. However, it's not quite right to say that consciousness is like music, in the sense that we never experience music in the absence of jazz, rock and roll, blues, classical, baroque, and so on. There's no such, it's not a thing, obviously, but let me use the word thing. There's no such thing as music if you take away all of its expressions. However, there is such a thing, which is not, of course, a thing, as consciousness in the absence of objective experience. So in that sense, the analogy is not quite right. You're right that consciousness is not a thing, but that doesn't mean that consciousness is identical to experience.
But would you say that all experience ultimately is consciousness modulating?
All experience is consciousness, but all there is to experience is consciousness, but there is more to consciousness than experience.
That's the part that's hard
okay.
to...
All there is to a movie is the screen, but there is more to the screen than the contents of the movie. I want to just add something to that, Francis, because I know that what I've just said, I could see that it satisfied your intellectual objection, but I want to go a bit further and to try and point out the experience that enables me to say all there is to experience is consciousness, but there's more to consciousness than experience. I want not just to satisfy you intellectually, I want to take you there experientially, or at least share with you the experience that enables me to say that with conviction. You've heard me say this before, but I want to say it again in the context of your objection. If I were to ask you now the question, are you aware? Can you give Francis the mic? Yeah. So, if
Yes.
I were to ask you the question now, are you aware?
Yes.
You'd say yes. You don't leave much of a gap because you've done it many times before. But there's a brief pause in between my question, are you aware, and your answer, yes. So in that pause, something happens that enables you to answer with conviction, yes, to my question, are you aware? What takes place in that brief pause?
It's awareness recognizing itself.
That's it. That is not an experience. That's not an objective experience.
Okay. Yes.
That is the experience of consciousness. That's consciousness's experience of itself in the absence of objective experience.
Thank you.
I've been trying to figure out a way to ask this question, and I think your analogy of King Lear and John Smith is helpful. So there's kind of an experience of I guess in the way that I think about it, blending. So in a sense, there's a realization that, oh, I'm no longer King Lear. This character is not, and it occurs in my experience that there is this character here, and that's not who I am. And when I was blended with that character, there's all of the mental content that causes suffering, low self-esteem, trauma, like that sort of thing. And watching it from the outside, it's like, oh, I can still see that. And of course, there's a lot of relief from that blending, and that character still seems to be there with all the same thought content. It's not taken as seriously. It's not as heavy, but it's still there, and it still seems like there's suffering. Does that experience make sense as I describe it that way?
Yes. Yes. The character remains, but its sorrow and its agitation gradually leaves it. The character remained. All your particular characteristics, your qualities, your skills, your interests, your proclivities, all of that remains. Your unique character as a mind and a body. But gradually, in most cases, occasionally suddenly, but usually gradually, the sorrow and the agitation that previously characterized your experience is gradually washed out of the system, leaving your character, your unique character.
So in that case, it's a matter of just staying unblended, seeing the character for what it is, or what it was, and allowing that with time that goes away.
Staying unblended, as you say, and seeing that your unblended self, your self that is not blended with your experience, is inherently free of sorrow and agitation. In other words, its nature is happiness and peace. The more you feel that, the more your sorrow and agitation will be, it will just gradually leave you just because you're no longer feeding it. It just dies of neglect. It just leaves you.
Hey, Rupert. I'd like to get a little more clarification about the meaning of recognition. I mean, we use the word recognition or realization or coming to know something. Is it, who or what is it that has the recognition? Is it King Lear?
No.
Who
John
does
Smith.
not exist?
No, it's John Smith.
It's John Smith, okay.
So remember, King Lear is not an entity that either forgets itself or recognizes itself. The only entity, if we can call it an entity, John Smith. John Smith is the only person present. So it is John Smith who loses himself in thoughts, feelings, actions and relationships, and seems, as a result, to become King Lear. What is King Lear? John Smith clothed in experience. John Smith clothed in thoughts, feelings, perceptions and relationships. So King Lear is not an entity or a person in his own right. He's just an apparent limitation of John Smith. So when we talk, or when we hear about forgetting or overlooking the self, we presume that there is a person or a separate self that overlooks itself. That's like presuming that King Lear overlooks the fact or forgets that he is John Smith. No, there is no King Lear, either to forget himself or to remember himself. There's just John Smith, who loses himself in thoughts, feelings, actions, perceptions, relationships, and so on, and seems to become King Lear. The teaching then, as a concession to King Lear, as a concession to the person we seem to be, gives King Lear something to do. Remember yourself, practice self-inquiry, practice meditation. But that's a concession to King Lear. There is no person called King Lear. It's all John Smith. John Smith loses himself in experience, and then John Smith comes back to himself, recognizes himself, or knows himself again. That's why it's called a recognition, not just a cognition. It's not knowing something new. Because John Smith started life knowing himself as John Smith. He lost himself in experience and seemed to become King Lear. Then he traced his way back to himself and knew himself again, recognized himself as John Smith. It's all John Smith. John Smith is the only one that truly is.
Okay, so it's not like the separate self is becoming more intelligent or more aware.
There is no separate self, either to
yeah.
be more intelligent or less intelligent.
Yeah.
There is no separate
Okay.
self. There is only the self, if we can call it a self. There is only the one infinite being or aware being. That's why in the Gurdjieff tradition it's called self-remembering, remembering himself, knowing himself again, not remembering something from the past, but remembering something in the depths of himself. That's what self-remembering, self-remembrance.